The rock told me that it was real, that it was authentic. I trust rocks. I don't trust some people. And so by putting my faith in the rock, I knew that there were three things that had to be true. If this is an authentic artifact, that means somebody carved it, they came from some place, and they came here to North America and planted this stone in the ground in the center of the continent for some reason. 1362, I might remind people, is 130 years before Chris. Columbus, the guy that never set foot on the land that we now call the United States of America that he supposedly discovered, that also had millions of people living here already. The notion that he discovered anything is ridiculous. And as I told you, there are a lot of people that don't like this research, and they don't like the Templars, and they don't like me. It's been, what, 13 years now? Do you think that if somebody could have proven me wrong by now, that I wouldn't have heard about it? You know what I've heard? Crickets. So let that one sink in.
Scott, you're the one who has taken up the charge that has proven that the Kensington Ruin Stone is a true, genuine Templar artifact. Tell me about your research in this regard.
Well, it's been quite a journey with the Ruin Stone, I will say that. It started in July of 2000 when I was contacted by the Ruin Stone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, who asked me if I would perform a forensic investigation on the Kensington Ruin Stone, specifically looking at trying to age date the weathering. And so that's what we focused on. We came up with a plan, and eventually what we did was compare the weathering of Revolutionary War era tombstones from out in the East Coast, where I collected samples from these tombstones with permission that had the same mineral composition as the Ruin Stone, actually a specific mineral being a mica mineral called biotite on these slate tombstones from out east. And they had the same mineral grain size and the same weathering environment. I mean, tombstones are pretty close to, you know, the environment that the Ruin Stone was found in, shallowly buried with the top just protruding out of the ground. So what I did is I took samples off the tombstones and I looked at how long it took for these minerals to begin to come off the surface of the tombstones. And that was about 200 years. From the Ruin Stone standpoint, I took a core sample out of the back and I did scanning electron microscopy to look at the weathering of the glacial age, because the glaciers carried this stone presumably into the Kensington area. I looked at the fresh fractured areas, and then I looked at what I call the split side. Because whoever found this, the Templar party that found this, intentionally split the stone down to this 2-to-1 ratio, which I don't think is a coincidence. And so this entire surface was made at the same time that they carved the inscription. So that allowed me to take a sample off the side, anywhere off the side, that would represent the age of the weathering of the inscription. And when I did that, and I looked at it under the scanning electron microscope, all of the micas that were present when the Ruin Stone inscription was carved were gone. On the tombstones, they began to come off at about 200 years. So the conclusion is that the weathering is older than 200 years because all the micas are gone off the inscription. So, and that's from 1898 when the Ruin Stone was found, because it hasn't been in a weathering environment since. So that automatically excluded anyone that was alive on the planet when it was found, going back 200 years from that date. So that made a late 19th century hoax impossible. Therefore, the only other obvious answer you have is it had to be genuine. And at that point, you know, I wrote my report, I submitted it. I didn't know anything about the controversy. I knew nothing about the Ruin Stone when it came into the lab. But I'll tell you what, I was educated quickly, shortly thereafter. And I was really surprised at the reaction that we got, because it went public. And some people were elated, others were not happy at all. In fact, it didn't take long for the criticism to come in and the attacks, many of them very personal against me. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? I'm just doing my job, right? Well, I didn't understand that there was a paradigm in history that this is the narrative. Christopher Columbus, discovered America, and nobody was here, and certainly not the Templars prior to Chris. And that's when it got interesting.
So you determined that the rune stone is a real artifact. What made you believe that it was a Templar artifact?
Well, that took a little bit of time, but actually it happened fairly quickly. Once this criticism came, I'll be honest with you, it pissed me off. I was happy to talk to people. I was happy to answer questions, but they weren't intelligent questions. It was just attack, this thing's a fake, and you're wrong. And eventually I got to the point where I said to myself, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Because once I want to say something that I think is really important here. My faith in my conclusions was because I trusted the rock. The rock told me that it was real, that it was authentic. I trust rocks. I don't trust some people. And so by putting my faith in the rock, I knew that there were three things that had to be true. If this is an authentic artifact, that means somebody carved it, they came from some place, and they came here to North America and planted this stone in the ground in the center of the continent for some reason. Those are absolute truths. And it was just a matter of following the evidence trail to figure out who did it. And it led me straight to the island of Gotland, which is a part of Sweden today and was part of Sweden back in the 14th century, because this stone is dated 1362. And when I went to Sweden 5 times looking for the evidence, looking at medieval grave slabs, looking at carvings inside the churches in these the 99 churches on the island of Gotland, which is where we found all these rare linguistic features, these runological features, these dialectic features, language features. Everything went to Gotland. And it turns out that in the 14th century, the only person who could have been able to carve an inscription of this complexity and length had to be a member of the clergy, because the common people weren't educated, right? By design. So what clergy did we have where all the evidence was on this island? The 99 churches all were Cistercian. And at that point, I started to investigate, well, who the heck are these guys? Well, they were a very interesting and very powerful order. In fact, the most successful monastic order in history, that started with one abbey in Citeaux, France. And then by the end of, well, the second abbey was started by a monk that joined the order in 1113 with 30 family members who are very interesting people that we can talk about. But he founded the first daughter abbey at Clairvaux. And by the time he died 40 years later in 1148, he had founded over 300 Cistercian abbeys. Think about that. In 40 years, from 1 to 300 abbeys. And by the time the Templars were put down in 1307, they had over 750 abbeys. This is incredible. So who are these monks? This is what I dug into. And Bernard de Clairvaux specifically, who was an amazing character. But what we learned is that he was the one that wrote the charter for the Knights Templar. Well, who were the Knights Templar? These were these medieval knights that carried the swords, that fought for Christendom, right? They wore the white tunics with the red crosses. You have to understand, I knew nothing about this at the time, but I just followed the evidence and it took me straight to them. So that's how I got on the Templars.
And what exactly do the markings on the stone say?
Well, it starts in the upper left-hand corner, and I should probably tell you that there are 9 lines of text on the front, 3 on the side, for a total of 12. And that compilation of text I don't think is an accident. There are some esoteric aspects that are connected to that, but I digress for the moment. Let's talk about the inscription. Interestingly enough, the first thing in the inscription right here is not a rune and is not a word. It's a number, the number 8. We can talk about the sacred number 8 in a little while, but that's the first thing that we have on the inscription, and I don't think that's an accident either. But it starts off here and it says 8 Gotalanders, Gotland, are called Gotlanders, people from Gotland, and 22 Northmen, probably Norwegians, on this acquisition business / taking up land. The longest word in the inscription is on line 2, and it means acquisition business or taking up land. This is why we came to the conclusion that it was a land claim. I'll come back to that. So 8 Gotlanders and 22 Northmen on this acquisition business / taking up land from Vinland far to the west. We had a camp near 2 shelters, and actually that word may not be shelters, and there's a reason for that. The L in here has a bar across the middle. The scholars struggled with that. They thought maybe it was a bin ruin where you have 2 letters that are built off a common stave, but that doesn't really make sense. We'll come back to that in a minute. So we'll just go with shelters for the moment. We had a camp near 2 shelters, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day after we came home, found 10 men red from blood and death. And then interestingly enough, we have 3 Latin letters that come next, AVM, right after the word death. Maybe they're invoking the Virgin Mary. I happen to think that the AVM is actually invoking the great goddess, and the Virgin Mary is just a metaphor for the great goddess. Keep in mind that in Latin, the V and the U are interchangeable. So people that are more Christian aligned will look at this as Ave Virgo Maria. But if we change it to a U, suddenly the game changes and we have a deeper, more, what I think, spiritual connection to the concept of Aum, A-U-M. And that is a whole nother story as well. The last line, on line 9, it says, save from evils. When we go to the side, it says there are 10 men by the inland sea to look after our ships, 14 days journey from this island, year 1362. 1362, I might remind people, is 130 years before Chris. Columbus, the guy that never set foot on the land that we now call the United States of America that he supposedly discovered, that also had millions of people living here already. The notion that he discovered anything is ridiculous, but I digress. But that was part of the problem, right? 130 years before Columbus, the historical narrative that we were all taught is BS. And so their evidence or their argument was, how could, a party get to the center of the continent when Chris barely got here 130 years later? Well, we now know that this is nonsense and that just about everybody was here in the historical past. But in this case, we have the rune stone. Now, there's one other thing I do want to point out when it comes to the inscription and my interactions with scholars that I had for about a decade until I got completely fed up with them and their dishonesty. But the word before the date that I said, 14 days journey from this island, in Swedish, that word actually means a rise in land, which could be a hill, a peninsula, or an island, right? It's been interpreted as island, but we now know at Runestone Hill, where the stone was discovered, it's actually a hill. The point in bringing that up is you have to be very careful how you translate from medieval runes and the words back then to modern Swedish and then into English. And I can tell you there have been plenty of problems that certain scholars have taken advantage of to try to prove their point that this is a hoax, when it is, in my opinion, the most important historical artifact ever found on this continent.
There's a dotted R on the rune stone. Why is this significant?
The dotted R is very significant and really is the the crown jewel of evidence that proves the stone is medieval. Now, the dotted R, as I was taught by the scholars in Sweden, was a modification of a rune that indicated a change in the way you said the R sound. And apparently in late medieval times, the language in Sweden was coalescing, and there were different sounds that were being added to the language. And to indicate that, when you made runes, you would add either a dot or a short bar, some type of a modification to indicate a change in the way you said, in this case, the R sound, by adding a dot in the upper loop. And so that is the dotted R. Now, what's important though, is that modern scholars in Sweden did not even know about the dotted R until 1935, when there were two artifacts that were found. One was a bone from an archaeological dig. The other was a grave slab from Ukna Church. I actually visited this church and photographed these dotted R's. And there were 4 examples on these two artifacts, both found in 1935. They were published in 1938. And then the world knew about the dotted R. But this begs the question, if modern scholars did not know about the dotted R until 1935, how did it get on the Kensington Ruin Stone in 1898? Now, are people going to tell me that this farmer knew about the dotted R, but the scholars at that time did not? The dotted R effectively proves all by itself that the Kensington Ruin Stone is a medieval artifact. That's important.
So Scott, I have to ask, is it true you found a Grail code on the stone?
Well, I'll be happy to tell you about the word Grail on the stone, but let me give you a little context first. Again, I trusted the stone. When the weathering told me that it was old, I knew it was real. And at that point, I decided to do something that turned out to be a pretty good idea, if I do say so myself, and that was to generate a detailed photo library under the microscope of every rune using low angle and high angle reflected light. The low angle reflected light brings out the three-dimensionality of the carvings. And as I started to do this, I took over 600 photographs under the microscope. But as I was looking at these things carefully, I started to notice things like dots and short lines that were added to the runes and the numbers that nobody else had ever noticed, because nobody had ever looked carefully, because it was a hoax. Why bother, right? So what I did is I would take these photographs, and as I was generating my folders of pictures, I had a folder of odd runes, and I stuck those with dots and strokes into a separate folder. And it turns out that the first 4 runes, if you follow the inscription in sequence, that are singled out with a dot or a short line, spells G-R-A-L. In medieval Old Swedish, that's Grail, that Grail. And I found it a rather interesting coincidence that the Cistercians and the Templars wrote the Grail legends. So is there another connection here? Absolutely. And I know that that's not an accident.
You also found a hooked X on the runestone. Tell me about that.
Well, the hooked X was one of the problems with the runestone from the scholars, because they didn't know what it was. But like everything else, this is a logic problem, right? I look at everything in my work that way, and everything has to fit. There can't be any anomalies in the data hanging out there, otherwise you're not there and your thesis isn't solid. Everything fits here, including the hooked X. Now, the hooked X is being used for the letter A, or the A sound in the inscription. Some of the hooked X's have double dots above them called umlauts, which indicate a slight different way in the way you say the A sound. And it just so happens that there are 22 of them. 22 is one of the numbers on the Kensington Ruin Stone, and that's another code that was used by the carver that we'll get into later. But the hooked X is very important. And what I find interesting about it is that the Templars have a connection that go back to the early Hebrews, right? And in Hebrew, in the Aramaic alphabet, the hooked X looks amazingly close to a straight line stonemason's version of the hooked X. And it's the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It's being used for the letter A. I don't think that's a coincidence either. But there's more to the hooked X than just that. And we have to look at it from the standpoint of symbolism. Let's just take an X for a second, okay? And chop it in half horizontally. If we look at the lower part, we have a peak, which is the sword, the phallic, the symbol for the male. On the top, we have a V, right? Which is the vessel, the chalice, the womb, the symbol for the female. And when we combine them into an X, you have the allegorical union symbolically of male, female, heaven and earth, good, bad, light, dark, yin, yang, the concept of dualism, of opposites that keep things in balance. And I think that's very important to look at it that way. But then we have this curious hook in the upper right arm. And I've always asked people, what is the hook? In fact, the first time I ever heard anyone give me a plausible explanation was when I was speaking to a group of Freemasons, before I became a Freemason myself. And the person raised their hand when I asked the question, and he said, a child. And suddenly it hit me. I realized that yes, it's a child, a little V inside the big V of its mother, which then prompted me to ask a question that to this day I still think I have the right answer for. People talk about the Holy Trinity, right? And I ask Christians, I say, what is the Holy Trinity? And they say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I say, that's good. So what's the Holy Spirit? And then they sort of tap their feet and think about it a little bit, and they don't really have a good answer. And I say, well, it's really not well defined, is it? And they say, well, not really. And I said, well, think about it this way. You got the father, you got the child, who's missing? Mama, right? Maybe that's what the Holy Trinity is. And maybe that's one of the things that the hooked X is. I think that's probably the most important thing.
So why was the rune stone placed in Minnesota?
Well, first of all, Minnesota is the geographic center of the North American continent. And they obviously got there traveling with the indigenous people, following the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes river system. When they got to Lake Superior, to the west end, which is now Duluth, they probably would have gone up the St. Louis River, a short portage into Lake Country, which becomes the Continental Divide all the way down to Browns Valley in the extreme western point of Minnesota. So obviously they wanted to get to the headwaters of the river systems. And it wasn't just the Mississippi, Missouri watershed to the south and the Red River, Hudson Bay, but you go a little bit north of there, you also have the watershed for the Great Lakes. But what's really important, I think, about geography and about what the runestone tells us as a land claim is it says from Vinland, far to the west. Now, on the Spirit Pond runestones, specifically the Spirit Pond mapstone, which is right there at the mouth of the Kennebec River, in runes it says, takes Vinland, takes 2 days with an arrow pointing to the right. Well, what's interesting about that map is that the Kennebec River is flowing east-west, but in reality it flows north-south. So this map has east at the top, which is consistent with many medieval maps that had east for Jerusalem at the top. So if we rotate that map 90 degrees and have north at the top, now the arrow's pointing south. 2 days sail from the mouth of the Kennebec River puts you right there in the Narragansett Bay area where the Newport Tower is. So in my mind, what they're saying is that Vinland is really Narragansett Bay and the Newport Tower. That's the starting point. And the runestone says from Vinland, from the Newport Tower, far to the west. And I would argue that what they were trying to say is they were claiming the entire continent, not just from Vinland to Minnesota, far to the west. The Templars were excellent business people, correct? And they understood what the tradition was to be able to claim land, right? And so you gotta, At that time in the 14th century, both the French and the Dutch had a land claim practice where if you could prove that you navigated to the headwaters of a river system, you could place a land claim stone in the ground and often a tin plaque in a tree for redundancy, right? But the tree's not permanent. The stone's going to be there, right? And so isn't it interesting that the Kensington Ruin Stone was placed right along the north-south continental divide of North America, and and by placing the rune stone where it is in Douglas County near Kensington, Minnesota, at the Ullman Farm, theoretically they could have claimed the Minnesota River, Mississippi River watershed down to the Gulf, and the Red River Hudson Bay watershed to the north, which is about half the continent. So suddenly, everybody used to say that the rune stone was placed in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden now, that thesis is gone. Now it's placed exactly where it should have been placed. But there's more to this whole land claim thesis that actually my wife figured out. And that was, if they placed this thing as a land claim, that someday they would have to come back and theoretically find to validate their land claim, right? How the hell would they do that? It was buried underground, right? Barely protruding out of the ground on one end. Well, Janet came to the rescue with the stone holes. And what I'm talking about is all across North America. In fact, all the way back to the old world in Scandinavia and into Scotland, we find these small, roughly 1-inch diameter, rounded triangular holes that are cut into rock of varying depths and angles at the surface. And the only way that you can make a hole like that is with a straight chisel and a hammer, and the physics of creating that hole create this rounded triangular hole. Now, interestingly enough, at the Ullman Farm, within about a quarter mile, maybe up to a half mile, we have 18 of these stone holes. Now, some of them have been moved during the time when Olaf Ullman homesteaded and settled that property. He moved some of them into the ditch on one of the fields near the swamp. Those are out of play. Some of them that have been moved we can put in their old position because we have pictures from the 1940s of those stones with the stone holes. They acknowledge them. And so when we put them back, it turns out there's a triangulation of these stone holes that intersect exactly where the rune stone was found. Now, call it a coincidence? I think not.
So tell us about other artifacts that are out there that you've studied.
Well, that's a big topic, but when I go back, it's fun to go back and think about the research and how it all evolved, and I always look at these things as logic problems. If this, then that, and if this must be so, and so on. And one of the things I said to myself, if they came here and they went all the way to what is now Minnesota in the center of the continent, there's got to be more. This can't be the only one. And it turns out it's not. In 1971, there were 3 rune stones that were found at the mouth of the the Kennebec River in Maine, called the Spirit Pond rune stones. And those are incredible. There's another rune, and they have the hooked X. All 3 of them have the hooked X within their inscriptions, and they have Easter table dating, just like these, just like the rune stone. They date to 1401 and 1402. There's another rune stone with a hooked X in Narragansett Bay. It's called the Narragansett Rune Stone. There's another inscription that's very interesting in Narragansett Bay. It's called the In Hoc Signo Vinci Stone. And anybody that knows anything about Templarism will understand that this is a phrase that the Templar used back in medieval times, and it's still used to this day within just all Templar orders. First coined by Constantine back in 325, I believe, AD. So that's very interesting. And then just up the hill from the In Hoc stone, where the Templars probably landed for the first time, we have a curious 2-story round stone and mortar structure called the Newport Tower, which sits on 8 round heavy columns made of stone and mortar that is an exact replication architecturally of round church, medieval round church architecture of the Knights Templar. Here again, we have another connecting thread that goes right to these same guys. And the tower is really amazing because it's been known since Newport was first settled in the early 1640s. It's first mentioned in the first governor of Rhode Island's will, Governor Benedict Arnold, not the traitor. I think it was his great-grandfather. But in any case, he talks about it as my old stone windmill. And that's where it got labeled as a windmill back in colonial times. There are a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense. First and foremost, windmills back at that time were constructed with wood. They had a round turret so that they could move the sails of the windmill. And unfortunately, the Newport Tower looks like it's round, but it's not. It's actually an oval. So it wouldn't work as a windmill from that standpoint. And I've talked to structural engineers, including my son, Grant, who laugh when I ask them about its structural integrity to serve as a windmill. The problem is there's no steel reinforcement, and by using it as a windmill, the lateral forces would tear it apart. So the windmill theory, under even minor scrutiny, doesn't work. But there's more to the Newport Tower. There are numerous astronomical alignments of the sun, the moon, the planets, the constellations. In fact, the north window aligns with the planet Doobie right about the year 1400, which would be over 2 centuries earlier than the current narrative says the tower was built. So I could go on, but the Newport Tower is absolutely incredible. Now, there are a couple of alignments I would like to mention in the tower that are particularly important when it comes to Templarism. And as far as I know, I'm the first person to point this out. On the inside of the tower, there are 8 arches, Romanesque arches between these pillars. In the west-northwest archway on the inside of the tower is an egg-shaped keystone that happens to have dimensions that add up exactly to 1 megalithic yard. Janet Wolter made that discovery a couple of years ago. Not to digress, but she also discovered that if you measure diagonally the dimensions of the Kensington Ruin Stone, it is exactly 1 megalithic yard as well. Must be a curious coincidence, huh? But this egg-shaped keystone, turns out, the south window on the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, creates a light box. Remember, it's taking its the arc is its lowest point in the southern sky, and it creates a light box that at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning will fully illuminate that egg-shaped keystone on the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice, which curiously is also my birthday. So I don't know what that means, but that's a pretty amazing event. It's been sitting there. We know it's been sitting there for over 4 centuries, and only now this is discovered. And what also happens is on May 1st, the east window of the tower creates another light box that at 7:45 in the morning also illuminates that same egg-shaped keystone. So these are marking important days on the calendar. The shortest day of the year, the winter solstice, and then May Day is the ancient Celtic holiday of Beltane, which I believe, in fact, I don't believe, I know that the tower was built by Scottish Templars who practiced the old religion. Beltane would have been a very important holiday for them. On the outside of that same archway, back to back with the egg-shaped keystone, is another keystone. It is a Masonic keystone that is what we call a Mark Master Mason's keystone that is notched at the top. And there's a round red granite orb sitting right on top of that keystone that I don't know if this is another coincidence, but when Venus first rises in the atmosphere, it's red. And Venus was very important to the Templars, and it's very important to the tower. But I'll never forget back in 2007 when we first documented that this illumination event did indeed happen with the egg-shaped keystone. I was killing time during the day and I noticed that other keystone and I looked at it. And this is what happens after you research something for a long time. You start talking to it. But I looked at that keystone and then I looked to the west and I said, what are you pointing to? And it hit me again. And I knew right away that well, let's put it this way. I went back and on Google Earth, I used the long-range alignment feature. And if you draw a line from the center of the tower through those two keystones, which are not centered in the archway, by the way, and no medieval stonemason would do that. No self-respecting medieval stonemason would do that. So that tells you that it's off for a reason. But if you extend that line from the center of the tower through those two keystones into space, you know where it goes? To Kensington, Minnesota. Now, that is not a coincidence. Hell no. I published that in my book, The Hooked X, in 2009. And as I told you, there are a lot of people that don't like this research, and they don't like the Templars, and they don't like me. It's been, what, 13 years now? Do you think that if somebody could have proven me wrong by now, that I wouldn't have heard about it? You know what I've heard? Crickets. So let that one sink in. The Templars had that ability to make those type of long-range alignments. Do you think getting over here was any trouble? I've heard people say they couldn't get here. BS. They were here, and they were here a lot. And this is one of, in my opinion, this is the most important historical artifact in the history of North America, certainly in the history of the United States of America. It should be the first thing that people see when they come into the Smithsonian Institution. And the Newport Tower is the most important stone and mortar structure on this continent, and it was built by our Templar brethren in the past. And don't think that our founding fathers didn't know about this, because they did. They just didn't tell anyone. And some people might say, well, why didn't they go back and exercise the land claim? Well, the reason is our founding fathers, who were Freemasons, and they were also Knights Templar, they just didn't tell anyone. They didn't have to finish the job by exercising the land claim. They finished the job by themselves. And we're living in this republic right now that they founded. And I'm so glad that you're doing this work, Tim, because right now, more than ever, this information needs to come out. People need to understand what really happened with the founding of this country, that it goes back to the Templars, who were persecuted by who? The Roman Catholic Church and the King of France. A monarchy, right? And what's happening now? We're going down that road of religious extremism, and people want to put in a dictator to run our country? No. That's not what our founders intended, and that's not what we really want if you believe in the Constitution and if you believe in what our founders intended. So this is really important to get this information out so people have the facts.
So you've looked at artifacts and sites, but now you're looking at documents. So tell us about those.
Well, the documents are incredible. And they are vast, they are deep, and they are full of information. They're Templar. They're absolutely Templar documents. And I think it's important too, one thing that maybe you're going to talk about this later on, but I think it's important that people understand that when we say Templar, we're talking about a tradition. And yes, the Christian Templars that existed from around 1100 to 1307 are part of this tradition, but the tradition continued. And that's what these documents talk about, is the tradition that continued in Scotland, in Norway specifically, and in Portugal. There are certainly other areas where Templarism survived, and they were involved in this entire mission. Now, the mission was to establish a sanctuary, a place that one of the documents talks about a free Templar state. These are the Sinclair Weems journals. Now let me back up for a second, tell you a little bit about what those documents are. These were discovered within a Masonic family back about almost 20 years ago now. And basically what they are is a series of journals that were written, 20 books that were written by 15 generations that were passed down father to son. 5 were in the Sinclair clan and 10 generations of the Weems clan. And basically what they chronicle is the Templars, the descendants of the Templars who were protected by the Scottish Earls for a period of about 80 years. The reason the Scottish Earls protected them is because the fugitive Templars that escaped from La Rochelle, France, went to Scotland, and they served under Robert the Bruce, and they defeated the British in the most important battle in the history of Scotland. Because of their service, the Scottish Earls were beholden to protect them. And they lived in the caves, the Weems caves, in the Firth of Forth for about 80 years, until it was time in 1395 and 1398 to bring those descendants of the Templars that escaped from France to the New World. They were ostracized. They had a completely different ideology. Obviously, they weren't beholden to their vows, right? So they wanted out of Dodge. And it was Earl Henry Sinclair who made 2 trips with 8 trips each time to bring not only the grail, if you will, of the Templar descendants, but also the treasures that the Templars brought with them to be buried over in North America in many places to be used for someday. That mission was called the Covenant, which is an agreement with deity, right? It's the highest agreement that you can make. And it's very important to understand what comes through in the journals and comes through in the Cremora Document, which is also reports, maps, notes, letters, all kinds of documents that chronicle this mission. And the mission was to establish a free Templar state in North America, a place that their biological and ideological descendants had already been. The Hebrews had been there 2,000 years before, and the Phoenicians before them. So they knew about that land to the west. And the one thing that people forget about, and they don't talk about, is the role that the indigenous people played in this whole story. They have their own secret society. In the Algonquin tribes, it's called the Medewin. And it's basically Freemasonry. They practice the same rituals we do, and the same rituals the Templars did. And that's how they formed this strategic alliance, through ritual and strategic intermarriage. And that's why the Templars had free reign all across this continent, because they traveled with their blood brothers. I know this because I have participated in the Medewin Sweat, and when I earned the right to ask the medicine man my questions, I said, I want to ask you about the Templars. And he said, oh, you mean our blood brothers? It went pretty well after that. Now, why is it that nobody's ever heard this story? Why is it that when the Christians came over, they slaughtered the Native Americans? In part because they wanted the land, in part because they wanted to Christianize them and control them, but in part they wanted to get rid of the witnesses who could tell the true story of what happened here. So the whole founding of this nation goes back to the Templars and their persecution by the church and their persecution by the King of France and the monarchs, right? Who persecuted the Scots. And so it's really a pretty simple story. And it was our brethren who took the torch from the Templars to wait for someday that came in 1776 to found this nation where people could practice whatever religion they want, right? This is not a Christian nation. And we certainly didn't want to set up a monarchy, right? We wanted to elevate the people above the government, not the other way around, which is the experience that the Templars went through. And how did that work out for them? So it's really pretty simple what's going on here, folks. And we need to understand that this is the history so that we don't make the same mistake again.
So now I want you to tell me specifically about the Cremona document.
Well, the Cremona document came into our life in sort of a sneaky way. I first met Don Rue, the man that inherited, essentially, was bequeathed the Cremona document over a period of time. And basically what happened is Don worked for a private security company that did work for our government. And they did some really good and sometimes dangerous work. But his best friend was a guy by the name of Bill Jackson. Bill Jackson, the two of them in 1968 were snorkeling and scuba diving off Bannerman Island in the Hudson River, and they found a decorative ornament that Don gave to Bill. Bill gave it to his wife, who was a gardener. And a year after that, in 1969, Bill's 5-year-old son, Mark, broke open one of those ornaments, and inside they found a couple of artifacts that had been hidden in there by Francis Bannerman, who was a Scottish arms dealer at the time. Anyway, these two artifacts, one was a clay tube that was sealed with beeswax that had parchments inside written in the Theban language, or the Theban alphabet. The language was both French and Portuguese, and contained an alternate version of the resurrection, a secret that the Templars certainly would have had because they are the bloodline descendants of those people, so they knew the truth. That was in one of the, that was inside the clay tube. They also found a brass device about the size of a hockey puck that opened up and had some brass inserts on it that had the word Onteora on it. Onteora is the word for North America that goes back 2,000 years. That's a word that the indigenous people called North America. Anyway, Bill eventually followed the clues in these two artifacts that led him to Italy, to Rome, where he met with a man named Gustavo Benvenuto, who was a church restorationist, whose family had a document that Bill bought, that at that time he called the De Leon file, but we renamed about 12 years ago to the Cremona document. And the reason we renamed it that is because this document spent time in the past in a church, the Church of San Sigismondo in Cremona, Italy. That's why we called it the Cremona document. Bill had the document translated. It was all encrypted in Theban, and it talked about a Templar voyage that began in the British Isles in 1177, led by a Templar knight by the name of Sir Ralph de Sudley, whose brother was William de Tracy, who was involved in the murder of Thomas Becket. You might know that story. So there's a connection there that's quite interesting. Tells you where his allegiance was. But he traveled to Denmark, and he met with the Danish king, who was also a Templar knight, King Valdemar, and he wanted to get a woman in his court. Her name was Altamara, and she was a navigator. And Valdemar gave him one condition: somebody had to marry her before he would let her go. The person that did that was Ponce de Leon. And that's why they call it the De Leon file. Not the Ponce de Leon, who was the 16th century explorer. This was somebody much earlier. So then from there, she helped them navigate across the North Atlantic to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, where they dropped off 26 people. 26 is 2 times 13, isn't it? Must be another coincidence. And they hiked, basically, to Hunter Mountain, to the Temple of the Goddess, where there were scrolls that had been hidden there going back to biblical times. That was a repository. and his mission was to go there and recover those scrolls. Once Ralph de Sudley got there, they spent time with the people of the mountain and the priestesses that ran the temple. And eventually he went through a 3-day ritual inside 3 different caves. And on the evening of the 3rd night, the priestess entered the cave and offered herself to him. And he said, "I've taken vows of chastity. I can't." And she said, "You pass. You can take the scrolls." But he didn't get all the scrolls. He got about half the scrolls. And he, so then after there was a battle, Altamar was killed. Her body was burned. She was put inside of a wooden urn, and her remains, along with several artifacts, were put inside this cave. And then de Sudley and the people left and followed down the Hudson River. They made it out to the extreme eastern end of Long Island. They wintered over. They repaired one of the ships that came and retrieved them, and then they sailed back to Saborga, Italy, where he gave a deposition in front of 2 clergy, one that represented the Order of the Temple, one that represented the church. And that story was called A Year We Remember, and that's the story I just told you. Now, what we now know is that half of the scrolls were left, but the most important scroll that de Sudley did recover was the marriage document of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But there were more scrolls that were left there. And in the Cremora Document material, there is a letter that talks about what happened to the rest of the scrolls. It all started back in 1968. Bannerman Island, which is in the Hudson River, north of New York City. I'm not sure how far it is, probably a 45-minute drive, maybe not even that. Francis Bannerman was an arms dealer, and his father sold arms to both sides in the Civil War, and then he would sell to anybody. His son would sell to anybody that would buy from him. And anyway, he stored a bunch of ammunitions on the island. This is the island right there. You can see their estate up on the top of the hill. But that's the old castle, the original dwelling that goes back to the mid-1800s. And just behind it was where they stored all the munitions. Well, Francis Bannerman died in 1918, and the place fell into disrepair. And in 1925, the munitions blew up, and it was a huge explosion, and everything went into the water, right? And that's why these guys were up there in 1968, because they were looking for some of these ordnance that had been blown into the river, and they would take it down to the Bronx, and they would pawn it for money. That's what they were doing up there. Well, anyway, our good friend Don Rue, and this is Don and I out in the woods in the Adirondacks, at a treasure site that these documents led us to. And we found a treasure. Can't tell you about it yet, but it was like the most awesome day ever. And these documents led us there, and that's one of the reasons why I'm 100% confident that these documents are legitimate. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why I think that, but that's not the purpose of this lecture. So anyway, that's Don. That's him today. He's 80 years old. He's 6'8". He's been shot twice, and he's dealt with a lot of bad guys. In my mind, he's a hero. He's one of those guys that did work for our government and knew that he would never get recognition or credit for it publicly. So when he dies, I'm going to tell those stories because I know them all. Anyway, this is his best friend, Bill Jackson. These are the only pictures that we have of Bill. The one on the left is when he was 19 years old and he was just going into the military. He served in the Korean War. And the one on the right was in the late 90s, and he's actually wearing a disguise. He didn't have a mustache, but he does in that picture. Anyway, so what happened was they're out there and they're diving in the water looking for ordnance. So anyway, Don, and you'll see in this next picture, is standing on the shore of the mainland, on the shore of the river, where a lot of these things got blown that far. It's about a quarter mile from the island to the shoreline. And he was swimming along the shoreline and he found two of these decorative boxes that got blown off the island. And Mrs. Bannerman apparently was a gardener, and she had elaborate gardens, and these were ornaments that were on top of the fence posts, and they got blown into the water. So Don collected these, and he knew that Muriel, Bill's wife, was a gardener, so he gave them to Muriel. And a year later, in 1969, she had these things in the garden. Their 5-year-old son, Mark, was running around the garden. He grabbed one of these posts, and he pulled it off and broke it, and it hit the ground, and they realized that there was things in it. So this is Don standing at that location. Approximately, it's a little farther up the river, but that's as close as we could get. And he's holding one of the devices that was inside that decorative ornament. It's made of brass. It's about the size of a hockey puck, and you can kind of see that there's some strange symbols that were etched into the surface, both on the front and the back. And if you look right here, you can see these symbols. Those are Theban. That is the encrypted alphabet that the Templars used back in the day to encrypt their documents. You'll see a lot more of this. But anyway, that little circle right here with that pin sticking out went on here, and it came out that point. And what this says in Theban is, to open, push the pin. And that's how you get in there. There were a number of metal inserts that were inside of it. I'm not going to go into all that stuff, but it had stuff in it. And anyway, that's how this whole thing got started. But there was something else inside that decorative ornament. It was a clay tube that was sealed on both ends with beeswax. And inside that clay tube were 2 animal skin parchments, and these are pictures of those 2 documents, and you'll notice they're covered in Theban script. That's that script that was on the outside of the device. Actually, that device is a navigation device, but we're not going to go into that tonight. This story is so complicated. I mean, it is so complicated. It's the most difficult forensic investigation I've ever done, and I'm still working on it, and I've been working on it since 2006. It's just amazing. Anyway, so there's Don again, he and I at the Newport Tower when we were filming an episode of the show a few years ago. And as I told you, he worked for a private security company starting in 1961 to 1994 is when they sunsetted the company and sold the stock and shuttered it. Bill joined in 1962 when he got out of the military. They were best friends. And that's why Don, well, the reason Don always was available to go is because he never got married and never had kids. His mother and his sister, who was mentally challenged, died young. His father died in 1965. He has nobody. Basically, I'm his family. Anyway, so he was always available to go on these expeditions with his friend Bill. I think I told you guys that he discovered a ship that is mentioned in the document in 1971 up on the southern coast of Newfoundland. We're going to go back and re-find that ship. Now, Don was there. I have his notebook. I was going to put those pages in here, but I didn't because it's just too much. But if we find a 12th century Templar ship, again, that they already found. They also went up on Hunter Mountain, where the Temple of the Goddess is, that you're going to hear about in these inscriptions, or these encrypted messages. In 1977, they found the tomb of Altamara, where she was buried. She was the navigator of the 6-ship flotilla that came over here in 1177 to 1180. When Bill died in 2000, his family in 2004 bequeathed everything to Don. They gave him everything. And all his research, and believe it or not, the first document that we're going to look at was decoded by Bill Jackson. He transcribed it out of the 3 different languages that it was encrypted in, and then he typed it out and he put it on a floppy disk, and he hid it behind a picture that he gave to Don before he died. And there's a long story that goes with it, but Don was getting ready in 2008 to throw that picture away. And when he went to take it out of his shed, the frame broke and he discovered the floppies on the back. Otherwise, who knows what might not have happened. So what happened is Bill did all this stuff in the field, and in the around 1980, he made a decision that he was going to write a book about all this stuff. So he started to interact with the academics, and we all know how that went, right? And I've read the stories about his interactions. One of those guys was a guy by the name of Barry Fell. Have you guys ever heard of him? He wrote a very famous book in 1976 called America BC. He was the first academic to actually write about pre-Columbian contact, which even to this day academics will not acknowledge. And Bill went to him to help him decode these documents, and Fell kept it and wasn't going to give it back to him. Not a good idea to mess with a spy. He got it back. In any case, this is the kind of experience that he had. I can certainly appreciate that. And so he said, screw it, I'm going to write a novel. And he started to write that novel. And one of the things that he did, I'm telling you I'm spilling some tea here because it's kind of cool tea. He wrote this, he started working on this novel, and he incorporated the story of the Oak Island mystery into his story. Now this is back in the 80s, long before the Curse of Oak Island. And he actually created a map as part of his novel. And when Zena Halpern, if you watch the show at all, decided she didn't want to work with Don anymore because he did all this horrible, she found this justification to do what she ended up doing, which was completely unethical, and I told her not to do it. In any case, Don slipped her this map as a test, and she went running to the brothers, right? And they've been using it ever since. That map is fake. The document. These are pictures that Bill took back in the late 70s of the document. This is one of the pictures of the title page. And there's some really interesting crosses there, which I don't have time to go into. But the one on the lower left and the upper right with the 5 dots. Now the Roman Church will tell you that that is the 5 wounds of Christ cross, right? Of course, they've always got an explanation. But that cross means something else to Templars like me, and it actually is the cross that the Atlanteans used way back when. But I digress. Anyway, that's Latin for the truth will set you free. The document is comprised of reports, like this one. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. Maps, letters, and all kinds of encrypted documents, like that. You see those symbols? I don't know what the hell they are either. But anyway, and I think I talked to you guys about this map 8. You guys remember that? With the 13 parts and then the long narrative on the back. What we know is that in 1908, the Cremora Document was copied for the last time by a guy whose initials were CLY. His ancestors that also did this work for the Templars also used the same pseudonym name, Clyphus, but they spelled Licinius different, and they also made their siglas different. And you can see those 3 siglas right here. See that? And they're all different, and they represent different ages when they did their work. And we talked about it. So, let's talk about these encrypted documents. In the 12th century, late 12th century, Sir Ralph de Sudley led an expedition with 6 ships, 144 men and women. Their navigator was Altamara. They got her in Denmark, and Ponce de Leon, not the explorer you're thinking of, a guy about 400 years earlier, was required by the king of Denmark. Valdemar said, somebody's got to marry her, otherwise she's not going anywhere. So he did. Anyway, so she was the navigator. They came over to North America. They got off at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and they hiked 26 people, 2 times 13, to the temple of the goddess. Their mission was to recover those scrolls. I told you the story about the ritual, the 3-day and night ritual that Sir Ralph de Sudley had to go through to earn the right to get those scrolls. And on the 3rd night, when the priestess offered herself, he said, I can't, I've taken vows of chastity. And she said, you pass. And then he was able to take half of the scrolls. There's a whole nother story about the other half, which we're not going to go into. Anyway, so those documents that he grabbed, he took with him, and eventually in 1180 he got back to Italy, at Saborga, Italy, where his deposition was taken. And that deposition is called A Year We Remember. And he talks about the mission, right? That is what Bill Jackson decoded and typed out and put behind the picture on the floppy disk. And that's the thing that we read. And when we got that, we're like, holy shit, this is amazing. Now, what you're looking at here is a picture of the Cremora Document that Bill took back in the late 70s. And on the left is what we call the Bernard de Clairvaux cryptogram. And you see a bunch of Greek-looking letters in a box up there. And if you look on the top, you'll see those crazy symbols that were in the previous photo. This is the key to decoding that particular cryptogram, which is about 6 pages long. After it was decoded, he wrote out the list. On the right, that's the list of the documents that de Sudley recovered in French. It's written in French. It's kind of interesting too that if you look closely, it says Bernard de Clairvaux. Remember I talked about Bernard and how he was the charismatic leader of the Templars. He wrote the charter for the Templars, for the Cistercians. And if you look here, this is 1118. So what happened is, in addition to the deposition, Bill Jackson wrote an 11-page narrative about his whole experience with this document. And it's brilliant. It's great. But one of the things that he did in the narrative, or in the document, he says the first page is missing. So we just assumed it was gone. And then it goes into the story. And he sold it to the Vatican in 1994. But what he didn't tell anyone, and we didn't know until 2017, when Bill's daughter Melissa was moving from Ireland to Scotland to be with her brother Mark. Remember the 5-year-old that broke the box, the ornament? She found these papers that her father had given her. And there was a letter in there. It said, if anything happens to me, make sure Don Rue gets this. That was in 1996. And Don got it in 2017. And one of the things that was in that envelope was this page right here, which was the first page that he said was missing. He was lying. He didn't want the Vatican to know. Why do you think that was? The reason is, this is the cipher phrase that you have to decode the document. So he sold the Vatican a worthless document.
Oh my God.
I love this guy. So it's all in Theban, right? The other thing that's on the back is a map of how and where they got in Jerusalem to get down to the ritual chamber where they found those ossuaries, remember, with the stuff in it? So this page is critical, and he pulled it out, gave it to his daughter, and in the letter he says, if anything happens to me, make sure it gets to Don Rue. It only took about 25 years, but he got it, you know. Anyway, so that's cool. Now there's a bunch of other cool documents that are in it, in this book, like this one here, which is maps of the world. And this is an obelisk in Egypt, I mean right in the middle here. And you can read my book if you want, and I talk about all this stuff. But what's interesting is that obelisk, and I forget which one it is, I think it's Amenhotep or something. But anyway, the top, which is a pyramid, right, came off. And inside there were scrolls hidden inside of it that contained maps of the world. That capstone, that pyramid at the top of that obelisk was stolen in 300 BC. This is the obelisk that's in Paris, France right now. How many have been to Paris and seen this obelisk? What's unique about it? It's right in the middle of Paris. There's a big circle there.
It's plastic concord.
Yeah, that's it. But it's got a gold dome because the top is missing because it was stolen. And the reason it was stolen because it had maps. That's what the Cremora Document tells us. That's just one of the things it tells us. How cool is that? This document is in there. Theban, right? It's all, we've had everything decoded. A year we remember is amazing. Now that's where the Temple of the Goddess is. I'm standing on a prominent spot, and it's remote as hell to this day. But there's carvings there, there's caves there. You go back to where the people lived, there's all kinds of structures that like you can't believe.
Where is that?
It's in upstate New York,
Hunter Mountain?
near Hunter Mountain. Yeah. It's not on Hunter Mountain, but it's near Hunter Mountain. Yep. 3-year voyage, 6 ships, I told you that, led by Altamara from Denmark. 26, she led him to the Temple of the Goddess in the land called Onteora. That's what they called North America back then. And then he sailed back and gave his deposition. So, going back to that Bernard cryptogram, these are the pictures that Bill took. Everything that he sold to the Vatican, he took pictures of. So we still have the information. We just don't have those parts of the document. He had to give them something, right? But we have it all. And they don't have the key parts. And they don't have the part that tells you how to decode this. Once you decode them, you end up with this list in French. And then in English, it looks like this. And there's a lot of really cool stuff on there. Heavenly iron, that's meteorites. How to drink the sea, that's basically a distillery. That would be helpful. And actually there's a page in the document that is as a drawing of how to make it. But I want to point out this one right here, a contract of marriage with Yeshua ben Yosef and Mariamne a Hasmonia at Cana. So he says in the deposition, the most important thing we got was the marriage document of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The magical device to show the movement of stars and planets. The Gospel of Mary. So this is another document that was tucked inside the book, and we have this page too. He didn't give that back. He didn't give that to the Vatican. He pulled it out. But that's an interesting cryptogram, and it uses... It just uses a code word, Quetzalcoatl. It's not spelled correctly, but because it needed to be a certain number of letters, it's spelled wrong, but you get the point, right? So the code word is Quetzalcoatl, and what you do is you number the letters alphabetically. So I think I've got them here. Yeah. So the first, number 1, you start with the letter A. So you go through your code word till you hit A, and when you hit that, give it a 1, that under that number. Now if there's another A, that would be 2, right? So then you go through, and then you go B, and there's no B in there. Then you go to C, here's a C right here, so that's 2, D, E, and you just do it numerically, and wherever it is you put the number until you get all 11 in this case. So then what you do is you take the 7th group, and then there's 5 rows, and so what you do is you align them vertically. That's the way they are, but you align them vertically, and then you read the message going across. It's hard, but once you know how to do it, well, once you know how to do anything, it's not hard, right? And then you decipher the message horizontally. So you take these rows and you put them vertically. This one goes like that. This one you go on and you just keep adding them like that. And then you just line them up. You have to use grid paper. And so they're all lined vertically, but then you read the message horizontally. And it's all scripto continuum. There's no breaks in the words, so you got to figure out what the words are. It's hard. But this is the message. Sailing directions to the land of timbers, fur, fish, and fierce feathers people, and of Onteora. So one is South America, the other is North America. The storehouse of ancient knowledge, that's the temple of the goddess. 3 oas from the pillars of Hercules. I think that's weeks, but I'm not sure. That didn't really decode very well. Southwest, 6 suns, south-southeast to the Trident Islands. Southwest here, 2 suns east is the land of riches, apes, and temples. But go west 1 moon to a river of blood-colored birds and more temples. So that's going from, the eastern South America to the Gulf to Central America. These are some of the maps that Bill sold. But I will tell you this, on map 8, that has 13 parts, there were 4 maps that were drawn out like this. Look at the detail on those things. And if you look up at the top, upper right of this one, this is the map they've been using on Oak Island for 10 years. And they're not supposed to have this. Zena basically stole it from Don and gave it to them. And of course, she took credit for it. I'm so irritated with her. Anyway. But it's this map that they're using. This is Nova Scotia divided into 2 parts. There's Mahone Bay right there, probably pointing out Oak Island. And there's a bunch of information here. But what they did not get is, you notice these numbers right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A little hooked X right there. And there's a hooked X up here in the date of 1179. That's talking about the Sutherly's trip. This is the map that accompanies that narrative. I'll get to the notes. She got the map, but Zena never saw the notes because they came later. And then that is, this is the northern end, northeastern end of Long Island. See that? And then that's southern Connecticut right there. That map over there. I don't want to go into all of that, but if you look at the top 2, you see the CLY? The little sigla at the top? The page number is boxed, and underneath it is the CLY. And that was the old CLY, the first Clyphus. That's his CLY. And actually that circle with the 2 lines, horizontal lines, that's a symbol for eclipses. And they use that for eclipses you can use for calculating longitude, because it's a timing thing. And you can measure longitude. So these are the notes that came from John Drake's estate when he died in 2020. And all the numbers on those maps that nobody knows what those numbers are, these are the notes that go with them. Now I'm covering up something really important on the right side. I just can't tell you about it because I don't want anybody going there. But these are the notes. And CLY, see at the top of both of them? That was done later. And there's a hooked X right there. Every page has a hooked X.
So is this encrypted?
This is not encrypted. This is just in French. It's all written in French. Now on the back, you probably remember I showed you this picture here. And remember I told you that there was a map there, but I couldn't show you? Well, I'm going to show you now. That's the date that's over on the right. And this corresponds to when they were laying out the alignments for the Newport Tower, for all the astronomical alignments. So that's why we say that it was built around 1400. It took a while for those alignments to be incorporated, and building that structure took a lot of engineering, a lot of materials, a lot of people, because it's big. And there's another hooked X right there. Now this is another picture of that I took. You see the map? You can see it's there, right? But you can't see what's there because I can't show you what's there. But it's there. Isn't that cool? Yeah. And we have about 6 of these, what I call invisible maps. Came in 2 parts. The first part was this and a map that I can't show you. This is one of the pages, and this is the alphabet, and don't even try because you'll never get it. But we figured it out because Don had some old stuff and we were able to piece it together. But this is the message. The power of God is within you. This is the final writing of this report. First done in 1308. That's a year after the Templars were put down. And revised 3 times till 1908. And everything that we have in the Cremora document is consistent with that date. The science stuff we've been able to do. The final putting of the relic is told here, 1597. So let's just stop for a second. What's a relic? And what relic are they talking about? You know whose skull that is on that flag? It's John the Baptist. In our lodges in Freemasonry, they're all dedicated to the Holy Saint John, not Jesus. Because John's the guy, not Jesus. In 1304, Louis de Grimard, by order of Grand Master Jacques de Molay, arranged for 3 ships to embark from La Rochelle to Local de Ramsey and Pointe d'Air and Leith de Sedel in the Isle of Man. If you go straight north from La Rochelle, you run right into the Isle of Man. 3 different ports. That's where the Templars fled. Dan Spartan, I told you guys this was the guy who started the agency that they worked for. And this guy wrote me a bunch of letters when I started working with Don, and he threatened my life. He said, if you pull something like Zena Halpern did, you're going to be dead. And I'm not kidding. He did. He threatened my life. Of course I'm not going to do that. I actually took it as a compliment. I did. And I said to Don, I said, I would love to meet this guy because I've read so much of the reports that he wrote, how smart he was. It was brilliant how he faked his death. And then he disappeared to Southeast Asia. That's where he retired. But he was writing these letters to us, and they would go through intermediaries, the network he called it, so that there's no way we could track him down. Guy's so smart. He paid for all of it. So what happened, I'm just going to tell you the story because it's really sad. But so back in like the 80s, he took a bullet fragment, a ricochet in his knee, and it bothered him forever after that. So he had multiple knee surgeries, but it never really was right. And then in the early 2000s, he got a knee replacement. That got infected. He got another knee replacement. And then at Christmas time, well, before Christmas in November, he sent some photographs of Map 8. We didn't know what it was at the time, but it turned out to be photographs of parts of Map 8. And I recognized some of the stuff in the pictures. It's like redrawings of some of those maps we just looked at with more information. And I'm like, holy crap, is he going to send you that, Don? Well, I don't know. So I'm like, oh my God. I mean, I was just like foaming, right? So around Christmas time, actually it was December 27th, Dan called Don. This is 2020. And they had a 3-hour conversation. And it turned out to be the last time they ever talked. Because Dan was going to get his leg amputated on February 21st. And he told Don he didn't know if he was going to survive it. Because 79 years old, it was bad, you know. So then Don calls me after they have this conversation. I'm like, Don, you got to get an affidavit from him because these things clearly were written on paper. I said, no one's going to believe these ancient maps are written on frickin' wrapping paper. Well, I can't get a hold of them. It was inside of a cardboard box, and on the top was an envelope, and in there was a letter from Dan's wife telling Don about Dan's death. He died the day before he was to be airlifted to get his leg amputated. He died of sepsis. But what he did was he made this box. It's a puzzle box. And Don had to figure out how to open it. It was kind of a thing that they had, right? Don was really good at puzzles, and so we had to figure out how to open it. And he did, of course. But this letter was so sad. And his wife, Lila, he met at a wedding when he got over there, and they got married. And it turns out he recopied Map 8 with his 15-year-old son. It took him 6 months to do it. But anyway, we opened the box. This is the only picture of John Drake that exists. Don would be mad if I was showing this, but you can't see much. It's shitty, but that's the best I can do. These guys did not let people take pictures of them. So we open it, and the first thing that came out was an affidavit telling us how he did the map, and it's 2 pages long, signed by 4 people, a lawyer. That's how smart this guy was. He knew that we needed that, and he put it in there just in case, and just in case happened. That's how smart this guy was. Anyway, so one of the things that came out of the Spartan box, we call it, is this cryptogram. And we call it the Zodiac cryptogram. So you can see there's a wheel with 12 points and the 12 signs of the Zodiac, right? And then you see a bunch of letters there. That's an anagram right here. Okay? You guys know what an anagram is? It's basically a word, and you take the letters and you scramble them all up, and then you have to figure out what the word is, or the phrase. In this case, we figured it out, Don and I, working together. The phrase is New Amsterdam, which is what they called New York before it was New York. Did you guys know that? Yeah. Anyway, so then what you do is the same thing. You figure out the anagram code word, or words. In this case, there's the anagram, and there's the code word. Then you put the numbers above in the same way that we did it before. So A, you got 1 here, 2, and so on, right? So then in numerical sequence, you find the zodiac symbol. So if it's 7, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then you go to that long list, you find that zodiac symbol, you take those letters in a line, you put them vertically, and you go through the whole thing, and then you read it across horizontally. And that's how you get your message. Line them vertically on grid paper, decipher the message using the letters horizontally. This message gives us the history of the Cremora Document. The document has been removed from the Vatican Library secret archives by Brother Schoner, a Cistercian legate of Fidenzio of Padua of Helvetia, then to Lisbon by Brother Andrew Michael Ramsey. Now, Andrew Michael Ramsey in Freemasonry is a very important guy because it was either in the late 1600s or 1700s, because the other guy did the same thing, but it was a century earlier. I think this was in the late 1700s. He gave a lecture, and it's called Ramsey's Oration. And he made the argument that modern Freemasonry evolved from medieval Knights Templarism, which is true, which is obvious now based on these documents and the journals. But he couldn't tell anyone. He had this document. He had the evidence. He knew it was true. And people criticized him because he didn't have the evidence. But he did. He just couldn't show anybody at the time. And now we know. It's like, oh, that damn boy, he had it all the time. And the Masonic scholars now that we've shared this with are like, okay, he was right. Anyway, to the Order of St. Lazarus in 1680, moved to England 1730, Samuel Pritchard. He also gave an oration making the same argument, criticized for the same thing. It was about 100 years earlier. Hidden in Wales by Gwadine Roche, then moved to London. George Cruikshank, who had it bound in a volume titled Sir John Falstaff. That's the Cremona Document. That's the book that CLY copied it into. The book was published in 1858. By the way, Sir John Falstaff is a fictional character created by Shakespeare. And Cruikshank was an artist in the mid-1800s who did all the illustrations in this book. But the copy of this book that they put the Cremona Document in, they wrote the maps, and was blank. It was a blank copy. Copied by Grand Lodge of Denmark, then the Lodge of Prince Edward Island, by Lionel de Waldron, June 24, 1875, after which it passed to the hands of Olaf Palm, Les Pierre Chatura by Vitruvius, and lost to time. Don't bother looking this stuff up. We've already looked. They don't have it. Those lodges don't have it. You guys couldn't look it up anyway. They wouldn't let you in. They wouldn't talk to you, let alone show you anything. This is the Theban alphabet. This has been used since about, well, at least since 1200. It's kind of a combination of things, but you notice how there's a lot of M's? Remember I taught you the M sign? Yeah. Well, there's a reason. It has to do with the Magdalene. But that's the alphabet right there, okay? And it's a one-to-one letter substitution, so whatever symbol it is, A, B, C, it's pretty easy. Once you convert them to letters, then you got to figure out the language, and then you convert it to English or whatever. And Misha, the daughter of Elizabeth, sister of John. Now, the reason this document is so important is because there's people mentioned here that aren't mentioned in the Bible. Like this sister of John the Baptist, nobody knew he had a sister, let alone what her name was. Of the river Jordan, took the red wine with the poppy in it, having been there for 7 days, and gave it to the soldiers, saying, a gift from the Arimathian. They drugged him. Poppy. It's a narcotic. Then came Ishmael, the brother of Benjamin, and the Magdala. We didn't know the Magdalene had 2 brothers. And there they are. The soldiers are asleep. They took him out and put him on a stretcher. Who is him? Jesus. She said, fold the headcloth alone. We lift up Jesus and took him to sleep with his ancestors, but Ishmael with his new beard stayed. They did the switcheroo. We have destroyed all trace of our being here. We are unclean. We fled Jerusalem, and all of Judea was against us. We fled to the north, always Thendra. I have no idea who that is. But this is an alternate, probably true story of the resurrection. And the Templars had it because this is their family heritage, their bloodline descendants. So who else? Remember I told you 2 days ago about the Telpiat tomb? And who's in there? And who took the bones? They were responsible for their own family members, right? So this was those 2 parchments on the front and back. It's the same message, but one is in French and one is in Portuguese. That's what those scrolls were. They were inside the clay tube that was inside the decorative ornament that blew off the island. Now, we don't have these parchments. I asked Don, I said, where's the originals? He said, Jackson sold them. He wanted the money, right? But he took pictures. I mean, I'd love to have the originals, but pictures are the next best thing. And it took a lot of work for this to be decoded. And there's a whole sequence of letters between experts and guys in Portugal that the guys in the agency used to decode all this stuff. This piece is one of 2 parts that we have. This was just folded up and shoved in the book. And Bill took a bunch of pictures of this. This is 3 different pictures to show the whole thing. so it was written in the book of the wars of the Lord. That's at the end of the back. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I'm going to show you the stuff that resonated with me. Now, you remember the hooked X, right? And how the Templars venerated the goddess, right? They embraced an ancient faith that elevated the feminine aspect of the Godhead, right? To at least an equal level, but probably up here because women are the life givers, right? Still are. Now, if you Google this right now, this is what you'll get. No copies of this exist anywhere in the world. Right here. Now, there's a bunch of stuff we're not going to go into. The goddess Wisdom, has commanded us, and we have obeyed. But we set not foot into Edom. Then a cloud descended from heaven, and out from the cloud. These are the people of the Lord, and I am their goddess. You will depart this place or be destroyed, for I do battle this day for the sons of Dan. Now, as you keep reading in here, it's pretty obvious that she's on an equal level with my Lord. Can't have that in the Bible, can you? The leader, okay, now just so you know, what's going on is you've got the sons of Dan, and then you've got the enemy comes, right? And there's a marsh. And she tells them, the sons of Dan, stay out of the water. And then beat the drums and draw them in. And so the enemy comes and they're in the water. The leader of the Edomites sent forth his chariots into the shallows of the river. Then did a silver beast descend from the cloud in the likeness of a great bird, and spat bolts of lightning from its wings into the water, and the horses of the chariots died. And the men of the chariots shook as with palsy, fell to the waters and drowned. Then a great flame emitted from the mouth of the beast, and the host of the Edomites were consumed. Kidnapped by the bikers. It was 73, not 75. Spartan group, Don and Bill, rescued her. She gave them a gold mine her grandmother left her. Cryptogram found hidden inside the recess in the gold mine behind the Tanit carving. That's the carving. That's a picture of the carving on that stone. Do you know what Tanit is? That's the ancient Phoenician goddess Tanit. And they would pray to her. That's Virgo, the constellation of Virgo. But anyway, that was the carving. That's a picture of it. I mean, this is a long time ago, but so what's it been? 43 years now? They could never decode that cryptogram until the Spartan box came along. What was the anagram? New Amsterdam. So we tried it, and it worked on this one. So 40-something years later, we finally get the anagram, the cipher phrase, and it worked. So this is another part of the book of the wars of the Lord. The Templars found this gold mine, right? I don't want to have pictures of this yet because I don't want it out there. But I'm just going to tell you what it is. It talks about Yahweh. You know who Yahweh is, right? That's the Hebrew name for God. But what it tells you in here is that the Hebrew name from God is actually two words, Yah and Weh. Male, female. Dual gendered. Just like the hooked X. It's the dual gendered. And we know what happened when Christianity came along, right? Can't have those ladies. Certainly not at the same level as the male God, right? I mean, what bullshit is that? But this is one of the things the church isn't going to put up with that, are they? Especially that word. So here's another cryptogram that came last May. So Dave Ryan was the cryptographer for the agency. He's the one that was involved in Misha and that alternate resurrection story. Remember about Jesus? He was involved in all this stuff. But I remember he was particularly involved with a guy in Portugal that helped him figure that out. So anyway, when he retired in like 2008 to Florida, Don went down to visit him. And he went in this room, and he was there with Dave's wife. And she showed him these wall hangings that were hideous. And she says, "Oh, what do you think of these, Don?" He goes, "Oh, those are beautiful." What are you going to say, right? So then he goes in the other room, and Dave said to Don, "What'd you say that for?" He goes, "I was trying to be diplomatic, you know." But Dave died in 2016 or 2018, and then later that year, Don gets a box. She sent him those 2 ugly wall hangings. So it pays to be nice, right? He calls me, "I think I found another thing." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I went in my shed. Remember when the picture fell apart? Yeah. He kept all this crap in his shed. And he goes in there and he's clearing stuff out. And he goes, I was going to throw these away, but then he goes, I couldn't do it. And then I dropped this big heavy thing and one of them broke, so I got one left." He goes, "Oh, I brought it in the house." And he said he was walking and he had set it on the floor because it's pretty cluttered in there. And he said he accidentally kicked it and it bounced around and he heard something inside of it. So what do? I get in the car and I drive to New York and we opened it. There was a space in the back. And there was an envelope in there about this big, and it was fat. It said, "For Don." I'm not making this up. This is how these guys do this stuff, right? You don't just give it to him. He's got to earn it, right? And this is what unfolded. But anyway, it's got 13 parts. There's that number again, right? And then these here ask a land claim, A.K. Candle Saga, and the date of 1898. This message happened in 1898. And if you look right down here closely, CLY. And there's the date of 1898. You have to figure out the code word, Sacandaga Lake, which is in this message. Number the letters above, just like we did before, right? And then you go, there's 13 parts, so you take 13 and everything is this way, you line them up this way, and you do it for all 13, and then you read the message. Line them vertically, read horizontally. And, oh, that's right. This had another layer to it because at the very bottom was the alphabet. They gave us the alphabet, but CLY he had encrypted it and he just gave it. And then there was 1 through 10 symbols too, because each of the groupings 1 through 13 were numbered with different symbols. So we had to convert the symbols after we got them in order. This one was hard. And then read it horizontally. When I saw the old one and my little thunder with their long black hair and a new garment of white deer hide adorned with quill work and her eyes wide, a big smile on her face, it was all I ever needed. The old one and Octalani, that's Choctaw for blue eyes, embraced me and together we walked to the lodge. So has passed the scroll of the wars of the Lord from the world of men. Know by the sigil of my ancestors, CLY, all I write is true. And that's his Indian name, Talico, which means gray eagle, CLY. So what happened was he went and recovered the copy of the Book of the Wars of the Lord that had been brought there from the temple of the goddess. Remember I told you half the documents were still there? In 1656, they moved them all out. They took everything to Montreal, except they diverted. and brought the Book of the Wars of the Lord to this place. And it was his job to go recover it and give it to the ETs. Because of just the sampling that we have, the 2 samples, it's no longer amongst the world of men. How else do you interpret that? I jump in if you have a different... I think he gave it to the ETs because the humans couldn't handle it yet.
Why would the ET, is that why the ETs wanted it back?
Because humanity was too stupid. They were too under the control of the church and by fear and by all that nonsense that they do. I'm sorry, I'm just going to call it what it is, right? And I think what it was is we're not ready yet. This is 1898. This is over 100 years ago. So they gave it back. But guess what?
Everybody has it.
No. We have it. We got enough right now.
Well, you have it by way of connecting the dots.
Well, we finally figured out what the message said 40 years later. We got that one part. And then the one was folded up and written in English in the document. My point is, I'm starting to believe there's a reason why we got this stuff now. There's a reason why I'm telling you, and I'm going to tell everybody on TV about this stuff. And the church is going to be pissed. Be pissed. Get over it. You guys had your day. It's over. It's time the world knew this stuff. I'm serious. Totally serious.
So you don't think maybe Vatican has one of those?
Yeah, I know they got it. They're sitting on it. Of course they have it.
That's what I'm thinking.
They're going to be pissed when they hear this. Too bad. It's time. So this whole elevation of the feminine, the dual-gendered nature, why is that so hard to handle?
I think the thing about swapping bodies
Well, yeah.
is really going to be it's going to blow Easter Sunday out of hell.
Well, sorry. Too bad. We'll make a new holiday. We'll call it ET Day. Right? No, I'm serious. I'm dead serious. And now, I've always sort of, yeah, you guys can have the ET stuff. I got my own stuff. I can't not talk about it now.
So will that be on History Channel?
Wow. We're talking with them right now. Nothing's a deal until it's a deal, right? So I don't know. We'll see. They're going to want this. I know they're going to want it, but they got to make the right deal. Otherwise, I'll screw them. I'll go somewhere else. It's not about, I don't care about being on TV. I've been on TV. And frankly, careful what you wish for. Anyway, message 4. Decipher using one letter over method. This one's easy. So A is actually B, B is C, C is D, and so on. The Roman numeral dates are kind of weird. They're bunched. See this one here? That's 13 and 90. The date's 1390. This message is about stuff that happened in 1390. The funny thing here is that you see the V with the dot? That's actually a W. That is V, meaning the letter V. If it doesn't have a dot, it's the number 5. So they had to do something to modify it so you know which one's a Roman letter, which one's a letter, right? So these are W's.
Well, W is a double V.
Well, in this case, VW, right? So if it's a V, the letter is actually W. You'd be surprised. It's simple, but it's harder than you think to craft the message. But you know what's on this page too? A hooked X. Every one of them. They all have a hooked X. It's an acknowledgement of God. I'm thinking of you. Bless this. Protect this, right? But what I want you to know is from there, this guy's all alone, right? They go south to the temple of the goddess. We embrace. I will never see him again. I am alone. From there, Kay told me, Kay is all over these things. But who's Kay? It's them. It's him. It's that same guy probably. As Lionel I was able, took refuge with the Ivri, that's the old word for Hebrews, in the Valley of Cold and from Sephad, that's in Israel, for they revere the he in who he. Do you remember I talked about Samos work? Yahweh is actually, you pull it apart and you go like this, and it's who he, male, female. They revere the he, the feminine of male, female, of the dual-gendered God. What have I been telling you? The hooked X. The goddess is on top. I'm just going to say it, okay? I was right all along. Nice going, Scotty. One more. This message is long. 24 sections of 12 lines each. This is one section. This message is mostly about Oak Island. Half of the information that's in these documents, I'm not even telling you about the Oak Island stuff. But this message is mostly details about Oak Island. I know the whole story. It's actually pretty amazing. And I never wanted to hear another word about Oak Island, and then I got punched in the face by these documents. So what's cool about this one, you know what the cipher phrase was? The power of God is within you. It occurs throughout the message 13 times. And the reason it's in there is because when you're decoding this thing, and I'll show you my work, one page of my work, there were like 11 pages of my work. You get to a point where all of a sudden you see T-H-E-P, oh, here we go. And if it spells out right, then you know you're doing it right. If you miss a letter, you screwed it up, and you got to go back, and oh my God, it took me 2 weeks to do this, once I knew what I was doing. But the power of God is within you is the key to knowing that you're doing it right. The letter K occurs 12 times. It's just random. It's usually associated with numbers, but it's just K. And then the last time you see it, it's spelled out K. The 13th time. And, of course, this is page 1, hooked X. This is blessed. This is protected. It's a sacred symbol. So this is my work right here. This is one page. I have 11 pages of this. I did this in February, end of February. We just got this stuff from Roberta. The second tranche of stuff was 30 pages of cryptograms. That's all I've been doing for like 2.5 months is this shit. Jeez, I'm sorry, but God. I screwed up here, screwed up here, screwed up here, screwed up here. I mean, the power of God is within you was the cipher. You start it right off with the power of God is within you. That's the first thing you get. And then down here, you get it again. And that's how I knew I'd screwed this up, because those letters didn't line up. They were wrong. 13 times throughout the message. But it kept you on track and let you know that you were doing it right. Does that make sense? Yes. Brilliant, isn't it? It's brilliant. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff, but this is the end. The Mickey Macs, that's the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. That's the local native people up there. Bring us squash, beans. The power of God is within you. That's the last one. And maize ground, so ground up food. We kill 14 bear and 16 deer. We share with them. They show us how to make coats and clothes. It is $13.95. Lionel VI grows strong like his father. He has 2 sons and 1 girl. I am his second son. So he's Lionel the 7th. Uriel pledged to the service of the angel K. Who's K? Remember in the other cryptogram, AK candle K, saga K? Who's K? He's got to be an alien.
It's an angel.
An angel.
Well, what's an angel?
An alien.
Well, okay. So this is that book I was telling you about. I'll just go through it quick. This is 2020, right? Remember, I published my Hooked X book and all this goddess stuff and the dualism and all that in 2009. And I've been alone, fighting the academics who think it's all crap. Well, it's not. The Hebrew name of God, which is spelled this way, but is Yahweh, has not been uttered in public for over 2,000 years. Some thought the lost pronunciation was Jehovah or Yahweh, but Sameth traces the name to the late Bronze Age and argues that it was expressed as Hu-He. It's in the document. Wow. How did they know that? That's how you know it's legit. You can't make this up. Hebrew for he, she. They venerate Hu-He, which is the feminine. I just love it. Among the Jewish mystics, we learned this has been an open secret. He wrote this 2020. It just came out. Just came out. And a brother Mason turned me on to it because he knew about my research. He said, dude, you're going to like this. He was right. You can buy this book. It's a quick read. I read it in 3 days. No, no, this is another author. This guy lives in New York. I'm trying to track him down. He's going to love my stuff because it backs him up. So he talks about the first time that the immutable word of God appears is 1400 BCE. It's the time of Akhenaten when the Hooked X starts. They started at the same time. And it was the three-letter word for God, right? Then you come forward, he writes about this. This is sort of a history of this. In 850 BC is the Tetragrammaton, Yod-He, Vav-He, right? See the downward pointing triangle? That's the feminine, remember, of the Hooked X? And it's now in the Torah. That's the name of God. Of course, in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, and the name went underground and was not uttered for 2,000 years. But after he wrote his book, he found out that he wasn't the first to discover this in modern times. Michelangelo Lanci was a Vatican librarian, and in like 1810, something like that, professor of sacred philosophy, he was a philologist, fluent in Greek and other languages. He revealed the secret of the Tetragrammaton and its dual-gendered nature. Published it in 1827, and his paper was immediately suppressed by the church. Boy, that's a shocker, isn't it? One of his students, he just accepted it, okay? The church doesn't want it, I'm just going to leave it alone. But one of his students that he taught it to brought it to Albert Mackey. He is a Masonic scholar from the mid-1800s, late 1800s. I read all of his stuff. And in 1869, he published it. So it was out there. He just didn't know about it because he's not a Mason. So then my Hooked X symbol, right? I took you through it. Monotheistic dualism. The lady's on the top, right? With the daughter and the Trinity and all that. It started at the same time, the exact same time. 1400, as Sameth says, right? And so we go to 70 AD, and remember I told you about the Telpiat tomb and the Jesus, son of Joseph Ossuary? So about 8 years ago, these scholars in Jerusalem contact me. They send me this picture, and they said, hey, Scott, we found this on the Jesus ossuary. We think it's a star symbol that's related to an ancient Jewish story. What do you think? And I wrote back, and I said, dudes, that's no star symbol. That's a monogram of two symbols. My Hooked X and the Tau cross. The Hooked X is a stonemason straight line version. Come on in. We're having a party. What the hell? Let her in. Come on. Maybe she doesn't want to come in. Okay, fine. The straight line stonemason's version of the Hebrew Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. The Tau is the last. Alpha, Omega, beginning and end. And it's on Jesus' ossuary. Are you kidding me? Let that sink in. That's amazing. But you'll never hear about it. Except for me. except for me. And then in 1362, we find it 22 times on this fake runestone, right? Olaf Ullman knew what this was, didn't he? I mean, it's laughable, right? It's just, this alone is laughable. This is the most important historical artifact in the history of this country for sure, and this continent, and the world thinks it's a fake. This is embarrassing for humanity, I'm sorry. And Tim Hogan talked about the hooked X and how it's abbreviated. You can say L, right? That's God, but it's spelled Aleph Lamed, which is A-L, abbreviated to A, which is the Aleph, which is the hooked X. It has a numerical value of 1. It represents oneness with God. The Aleph is the first letter. It's used for A in the 5 runic inscriptions found in North America, including the Kensington Ruin Stone. 14th, 15th centuries. It's analogous to the Hebrew Aleph, which is sacred, secret symbol used by the Templars, whose ancestry is Jewish, going back to the 12 tribes. It's a symbol for deity. That's why it shows up in all those documents. Because CLY knew the secret. He understood that if we want these documents to be protected, the hooked X has got to be there because it was acknowledgement of deity. That's why the monks carved it. That's why they wrote it. For future initiates like me and now you to recognize. Because you guys, whether you realize it or not, I just initiated you. It means to teach, right? So now you know the secret. In this case, was to bless and protect that sacred land claim of the Templars, which is now United States, founded by Freemasonry.